If we love drawing street scenes, perspective can often be a bit of a challenge. But most perspective teaching uses examples where the street is on level ground. Personally, I found the most difficult situation to draw streetscapes is when the street is sloping downhill, as in this scene. Now, it doesn't look as steep as it really is in real life. Here we are looking up the same street, and I think it gives a better idea of the steepness of the street. So how does perspective work in this sort of situation? But I see a lot of drawings where the perspective on these steeply sloping streets is not correct. The scale becomes all wrong, the details become squashed, and adjoining buildings look as though they don't belong together. So what do we have to watch out for? Now we're looking down the street again. And look, I know it's not particularly beautiful architecture, but it's a really clear example of the main points about understanding how to draw a downward hill and how perspective works with it. First thing always, when we're working out the perspective of a scene, is to determine the eye level. It's even more important when the street is sloping down or sloping up, because it's not intuitive. This wall is built with large concrete blocks, which is great for perspective because it helps us to work out where is eye level. And eye level is where we actually have a line that's not angled with the perspective, but it's actually horizontal. I can see that where these two courses of concrete blocks join is pretty much horizontal. So this is eye level. When I stood and took this photo, this was the level where my eyes were. And it may look too high if we're down there. It may even look too high here. But of course the street was still going upwards and my feet were higher than the bottom corner of the building. Having found eye level, then we want to see where the perspective lines cross it, because that will be our vanishing point. So I like to look at the top and bottom lines. This is the last line on the building we have in the stonework the whole way along the building. There we can see that the perspective lines do cross on eye level, just as those little theory diagrams tell us they should. We can add a few more lines in. So we can see that all the rules of perspective still work here. The really important thing to see is that the one line here that doesn't join our perspective pattern is the ground level line. Here we have the ground level line, and it does not connect in any way with the eye level or perspective line. And that's because for ground level to join in this pattern, it has to be parallel to these lines in real life. The other thing to notice is that the ground level sits along this line here, but if we look further up the street, the ground level changes to something more like this. And that's because at this point, the slope becomes less steep. And so this ground level line changes direction. The principle is that because the ground level is not parallel to all the other horizontals in our wall, but slopes down, or up for that matter, it doesn't fit in to the perspective patterns. So that's the first thing to realize. The other really important thing to realize is that although we're drawing a downhill slope, the line actually goes upwards. It can be easy in our head to think it somehow should be going downwards. In this example, it goes upwards a lot, so it's kind of easy to see. But we might make the mistake if we don't look carefully and think somehow the upward line here is going to be going up in a way to fit into the perspective pattern. And then we're going to have problems further down the street where we run out of room for the buildings. And we'll just have a quick look further down the street. Here we have the ground level line, and we can see here how it changes where there's a shift in the steepness of the slope. Let's just have a quick look. Find eye level, that's about the horizontal line. And we can see that these perspective lines all line up at the same point. And the important thing to notice is how the architect has designed the details at ground level to allow for the fact that the ground is not flat. So here, where this part of the building is set back, we see there are some steps that build up ground level, and that this section is horizontal and this section slopes up with the slope of the ground. And therefore these windows are closer to the ground here than down here. And for this window down here, the left-hand corner of the window is much closer to the ground than the right-hand corner of the window. These are the things that we need to notice, and that these windows don't align in any way. Let's look at a very different example, one that actually fooled me for a moment. Here we have a more interesting streetscape example. This is a house on a corner, so the street is relatively flat in front of us, but this side street is steeply sloping. And when I first saw this photo, I thought this is a great example, because having had an example where the downward sloping street actually was an upward line, I thought, here's an example of a downward sloping line. I was thinking that for quite some time, and then I suddenly realized that in fact, it's not the case. The line actually slopes very, very slightly down up here, and then there's a shift in the slope of the ground, and it goes upwards, and at the bottom of this block it goes upwards even more. So we actually have 3 levels of slope that we need to adjust our line for. Only one of them ever so slightly actually goes downhill. This is why I keep saying in all my videos, careful observation is key. We cannot draw accurately what we haven't observed accurately. Most of the problems we have with our drawing do not come from lack of drawing skills. They come from the fact that we're drawing what we think we've seen. And because we know this is a downward slope, it can trick our brain into assuming this is a downward line. And when we try and draw that, we're drawing what we think we've seen, not what's actually here. How would I seek to understand this scene? I find eye level. Eye level's about here, and that's a bit high on the front if you compare it with this shop window, but the ground continues to slope up across the roadway, and so I'm higher than these people are, and I'm higher than this footpath here. So we find the perspective lines that give an indication of the perspective pattern. And we can see that they all meet on the eye level line at the vanishing point. Again, in this example, we can see that if we look at the main ground level line, which would be this one for our scene, it slopes upwards, even though it slopes down in real life, and that it doesn't fit into the perspective lines. Understanding this helps us to observe our reference, whether it's a photo or in real life, much more accurately, which now means we have a chance to draw a complex perspective complication much more accurately, because we're not presuming what we think is there. So I'm going to demonstrate drawing this scene and highlight a few key points in the construction of a downward sloping perspective scene. But before I do that, I'll have a quick look at an example of a drawing I drew earlier for a perspective video of a street in Edinburgh that again was a downward sloping street. And we can see that while the street slope changes 3 times before it flattens out at the bottom here, all of the lines are actually sloping upwards. The center one to a lesser degree. And we can notice that at ground level, that means things such as a row of windows are not the same distance off the ground as they move along and the ground falls away. It means that windows and even doors don't align from building to building because they have to drop in height in response to lower ground levels. So we always have to be noticing how the architect has adjusted for the drop in ground level. Perspective lines still work above the ground level line. We have to be particularly vigilant in our observation as to how the buildings actually cope with the sloping ground. So let's do it in a new drawing. As always, I start at the spot I think it's going to be easiest to get correct proportions, which in this case is the top corner of the street. Now I know the eye level, having worked it out earlier. The important thing is that I start with all these perspective lines and I get them correct. I get the main ones correct. So I spend a lot of time measuring the angles with my pen, as I always do, and being aware of lines such as on the awning which don't follow perspective lines. I leave the spot where the pedestrians are in front of the building and I go further down the street. I use a 0.5mm pen for this closest building, and for the further buildings in the street I use a 0.3 to give a lighter feel that helps give the effect of distance. So now I start to put in the figures. I probably draw them a little bit too large, but I think I actually get away with it in this case. With the figures done, I can continue drawing the ground floor parts that I've left empty at this point. And so now I'm drawing the upper part, and I'm having to work really hard to make sure I do get these angles right. It's easy not to do these top perspective angles as high as they should be. So now I can work on the second building with my 0.3mm pen. I switched pens back and forth a bit because I'd left this awning part to do, because I couldn't work out the alignment for the awning until I'd drawn the building underneath. Basically, I use what I've already drawn to check the alignment of the parts I haven't yet drawn, so that hopefully they line up in my drawing the same way as they line up in the reference. I really leave this ground level line until pretty much last. Again, I measure the angle of the ground with my pen and use that to just make sure I still get it, because it's going to be the hardest line to draw in the end. And really just then I play with the tones a little bit to provide some contrast and get the shadows done. Does it look downhill?